On a bitter February morning in 1990, in the small town of Cookeville, Tennessee, a mother named Patricia Daniels woke to find her 7-year-old daughter's bedroom empty. The bed was made. The window was closed. The front door remained locked from the inside. Little Rebecca Daniels had vanished from a house secured from within, leaving behind only her favorite stuffed rabbit, and a community that would spend the next 33 years asking the same impossible question. How does a child disappear from a locked house in the middle of the night without a single sound? And who among us knew the answer all along? Cookeville sits in the rolling hills of the Upper Cumberland region, a town of modest homes and proud traditions where church bells mark the hours and everyone knows their neighbors by name. In 1990, it was a place of 17,000 souls, where the local newspaper still printed birth announcements on the front page, and the biggest employer was the Tennessee Tech University. Main Street featured a hardware store that had been family-owned for 4 generations, a diner where the coffee was always hot, and a courthouse square where veterans gathered on benches to watch the world go by. The Daniels family lived on Maple Drive, a quiet street lined with Bradford pear trees that bloomed white each spring. Their house was a modest ranch-style home with pale yellow siding, black shutters, and a chain-link fence surrounding a backyard where Rebecca spent hours pushing her toy shopping cart and talking to imaginary friends. Patricia Daniels, 29 years old, worked the evening shift at the regional medical center as a nursing assistant. Her husband, Thomas Daniels, 32, managed the parts department at the Chevrolet dealership on Interstate 40. They had been married for 9 years, high school sweethearts who had stayed in the town where they grew up. Rebecca was their only child, a girl with strawberry blonde hair that her mother braided each morning before school, and green eyes that seemed too large for her small face. She attended Jefferson Elementary, where her second-grade teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Heitwer, would later tell investigators that Rebecca was quiet but diligent, a child who colored inside the lines and always raised her hand before speaking. She loved strawberry ice cream. She was learning to read chapter books. She had a loose front tooth that she wiggled constantly with her tongue. The night of February 13th was unremarkable in its ordinariness. Patricia arrived home from her shift at the hospital at 11:45. Her shoes squeaking on the linoleum kitchen floor as she set down her purse and keys. Thomas was watching the late news, the blue glow of the television illuminating the living room. Rebecca had been asleep since 8:30, he told his wife. She had eaten her dinner without complaint, chicken nuggets and green beans, had taken her bath, and had asked him to read her favorite book about a bear who couldn't sleep. He had checked on her before settling in front of the television, he said. She was sleeping peacefully, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Patricia looked in on their daughter at midnight, standing in the doorway and listening to the soft rhythm of Rebecca's breathing. The nightlight, shaped like a crescent moon, cast gentle shadows across the walls decorated with drawings of flowers and rainbows. Everything was as it should be. Patricia showered, set the alarm clock for 6:30, and fell asleep beside her husband in the bedroom at the end of the hall. At 6:35 on the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, Patricia opened the door to Rebecca's bedroom and found it empty. The bed was made with precision unusual for a 7-year-old, the pink comforter pulled tight and tucked beneath the pillows. Rebecca's house slippers sat paired beside the bed. Her school clothes, laid out the night before, remained folded on the dresser. The window was closed and locked from the inside, the curtains drawn. The door had been shut, as it always was at bedtime. Patricia stood in the doorway, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with what should have been there. For 3 full seconds, she simply stared, waiting for her daughter to emerge from the closet or pop up from behind the bed in some game she didn't understand. Then she screamed her husband's name. Thomas ran from the bedroom, his hair disheveled, his eyes confused. Patricia was already moving through the house, calling Rebecca's name in a voice that climbed higher with each repetition. They checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room, the garage. Thomas yanked open the door to the basement and descended the stairs 3 at a time, calling for his daughter in the dim space filled with storage boxes and a washer and dryer. Patricia stood in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she gripped the counter, and noticed what she had not noticed before. The back door was still locked with the chain latch secured from the inside. The front door showed the deadbolt engaged. Every window in the house remained latched shut. At 6:41, Thomas called the Cookeville Police Department. The dispatcher who answered heard a man's voice, steady but strained, reporting that his 7-year-old daughter was missing from their home. He provided the address. He stated that they had discovered her absence approximately 6 minutes earlier. He confirmed that all doors and windows were secured. The dispatcher noted in her log that the caller's tone was remarkably composed for a parent reporting a missing child. Officers Bradley Morrison and Janet Kelso arrived at 6:53. They would later describe the scene in their incident report with clinical precision. The parents met them at the front door. The mother was crying, her face flushed, her breathing rapid. The father stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his expression grave but controlled. The house was neat, orderly, with no signs of disturbance or forced entry. The child's bedroom appeared undisturbed except for the absence of the child herself. Officer Morrison began a methodical search of the property, while Officer Kelso took initial statements. Patricia spoke rapidly, her words tumbling over each other as she described the previous evening, the routine, the normalcy of everything until the moment she had opened that door. Thomas stood with his arms crossed, answering questions in complete sentences, providing specific times and details. Officer Kelso noted in her report that while the mother's distress was evident and appropriate, the father maintained an unusual degree of calm throughout the interview. By 7:15, additional units had arrived. Sergeant Michael Doyle, who had been with the department for 18 years, took command of the scene. He ordered a door-to-door canvass of the neighborhood, requested a tracking dog from the county sheriff's office, and contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to request assistance with a possible abduction case. The word abduction hung in the cold February air like smoke. Within 2 hours, Maple Drive had transformed into a staging area for one of the largest search operations Cookeville had ever seen. Neighbors emerged from their homes, bundled in coats and scarves, speaking in hushed voices about the little girl with the strawberry blonde hair. The high school football team arrived in uniform, organizing into search parties. Members of the First Baptist Church set up a table with coffee and sandwiches. Local media vans parked along the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. The tracking dogs arrived at 9:30. A German shepherd named Duke and his handler, Deputy Frank Mitchell from the Putnam County Sheriff's Office, began at Rebecca's bedroom. The dog circled the room twice, sniffing the bed, the floor, the window. Then Duke did something that would puzzle investigators for years to come. The dog sat down in the middle of the room and refused to move. Deputy Mitchell tried again, offering the dog Rebecca's nightgown to reinforce the scent. Duke stood, walked to the bedroom door, then returned to the center of the room and sat down again. "The scent ends here," Deputy Mitchell told Sergeant Doyle. "It doesn't lead anywhere. It just stops." Volunteers spread across a 3-mile radius, walking through yards, checking sheds and garages, calling Rebecca's name until their voices grew hoarse. They searched the woods behind the elementary school, the playground at the park, the banks of Cane Creek where children sometimes played in warmer months. They found nothing. No footprints, no torn fabric caught on branches, no sign that a child had passed through any of these places. At the Daniels house, investigators conducted a more thorough examination. Detective Sarah Chen from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, who specialized in cases involving missing children, walked through each room with methodical attention. She noted the locked windows, the secured doors, the absence of tool marks or signs of tampering. She examined Rebecca's bedroom with particular care, photographing the made bed, the folded clothes, the untouched slippers. "Talk me through the evening again," Detective Chen said to Thomas Daniels as they stood in the living room. It was past noon now, the winter sun offering little warmth through the windows. Thomas recounted the timeline once more. Rebecca had finished dinner at 6:15, bath time at 7, stories and bedtime at 8, maybe 8:15. He had checked on her at 9:30 when he got up to use the bathroom. She was sleeping. The house was quiet. His wife came home at 11:45. They went to bed shortly after midnight. "And you didn't hear anything during the night?" Detective Chen asked. "No sounds, no movement." "Nothing," Thomas said. His voice remained level, his hands resting calmly in his lap. Patricia sat on the couch, a crumpled tissue in her hands, her eyes red and swollen. She had answered the same questions multiple times. Her responses consistent, but delivered through tears and gasping breaths. Those who knew Thomas Daniels said he was a good father, present and involved in his daughter's life. He coached her soccer team in the fall. He took her to get ice cream on Saturday afternoons. But as the day wore on and the search continued to yield nothing, some of the investigators began to notice things that didn't quite fit the pattern of a distraught parent. Deputy Sheriff Robert Hawkins, who had stood in the Daniels' living room taking notes, would later recall, "He never asked what we were doing to find her." Most parents in that situation, they're frantic, demanding updates every 5 minutes, wanting to know what leads we're following. He just sat there, answering questions, nodding when we spoke. His composure was remarkable, unsettling even. The first inconsistency emerged that afternoon. Detective Chen was reviewing the timeline when she noticed something odd about the distance and timing. Thomas had stated he was at work until 5:30 on February 13th. The Chevrolet dealership closed at 5:30, but Thomas's supervisor, Carl Henderson, mentioned during a routine follow-up interview that Thomas had actually left work at 4:45 that day, saying he needed to get home early. That left 45 minutes unaccounted for, in a commute that typically took 12 minutes. When asked about this discrepancy, Thomas seemed momentarily confused before explaining that he had stopped at the grocery store to pick up milk. Detective Chen noted this response, but also noted that there was no receipt among the family's papers, and the milk in their refrigerator was still 3/4 full and dated from 4 days earlier. The second inconsistency involved the made bed. Rebecca was 7 years old, and according to her teacher and family friends, she was not particularly neat or organized. Mrs. Hightower, her teacher, told investigators that Rebecca often forgot to put her name on her papers and frequently left her coat in the classroom. Yet the bed in her room was made with almost military precision, the corners tucked, the pillow positioned exactly center. Could Rebecca have made her own bed that morning? Detective Chen asked Patricia. Patricia shook her head. "She never makes her bed. I usually do it when I'm cleaning. I hadn't been in her room since the previous afternoon." "So someone made it after she was last seen in it," Detective Chen said, more to herself than to anyone else. That evening, as darkness fell and the temperature dropped to 28 degrees, the search was suspended until morning light. Volunteers dispersed to their homes, exhausted and heartsick. The Daniels family remained at their house, now under constant observation by law enforcement. Thomas sat in the living room, the television off, staring at nothing. Patricia lay in Rebecca's bed, clutching the stuffed rabbit, refusing to leave the room. February 14th became February 15th, then the 16th, then the 17th. The search expanded to include abandoned buildings, construction sites, and rural properties outside town limits. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the surrounding countryside. Rebecca's photograph appeared on the evening news in Nashville, then on networks across Tennessee. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children distributed flyers with her image. Strawberry blonde hair, green eyes, last seen wearing pink pajamas with unicorns. Tips flooded the police hotline. A woman in Cookeville claimed to have seen a girl matching Rebecca's description at a gas station. The lead was investigated and dismissed. A psychic from Memphis called with information about a red barn and a creek. Officers followed up. There was no red barn in the area described. An anonymous caller suggested looking at Thomas Daniels more closely. That tip, investigators were already following. On February 20th, exactly 1 week after Rebecca vanished, Detective Chen sat across from Thomas in an interview room at the police station. Patricia was not present. This was voluntary, Thomas had been assured. He was not under arrest. He was free to leave at any time. He had agreed to come in to answer more questions, to help clarify certain details that weren't quite adding up. "Tell me about your marriage," Detective Chen began. Thomas looked surprised by the question. "It's fine, we're fine. Patricia told us that you'd been arguing more frequently in recent months. Is that accurate?" "Every couple argues," Thomas said. "It doesn't mean anything." "What were you arguing about?" A pause. Thomas shifted in his chair. "Money mostly, the usual stuff." Detective Chen let the silence stretch out. This was a technique she had perfected over years of interviews. People were uncomfortable with silence, compelled to fill it. "We wanted another child," Thomas finally said. "Patricia did anyway. But finances were tight. I thought we should wait." "That must have created tension," Detective Chen offered. "Some, nothing serious." The interview continued for 3 hours. Detective Chen circled back to the same questions repeatedly, approaching them from different angles, looking for contradictions or revelations. Thomas's story remained consistent. He had been home with Rebecca. She had gone to bed. He had checked on her. In the morning she was gone, but his body language told a different story. He touched his face frequently, particularly around his mouth. His eyes broke contact when discussing certain topics. His breathing changed when Detective Chen mentioned the made bed or the 45 missing minutes from his timeline. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves as they watched the interview through the two-way mirror. Something was wrong here. Something in Thomas Daniels' demeanor, his unnatural composure, the way he recounted facts without emotion. Parents of missing children were supposed to fall apart. They were supposed to beg for help, to plead for their child's safe return. Thomas Daniels sat in that interview room like a man discussing the weather. On March 1st, investigators executed a search warrant for the Daniels house. They removed computers, personal papers, clothing, and samples from the carpet and walls. Forensic specialists treated Rebecca's bedroom with luminol, a chemical that reveals the presence of blood even after attempts to clean it away. When they turned off the lights and sprayed the chemical, portions of the bedroom floor glowed with an eerie blue-green luminescence. Blood. Someone had bled in this room, and someone had cleaned it carefully. The evidence was sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Laboratory in Nashville. DNA analysis in 1990 was still a developing technology, more time-consuming and less refined than it would become in later years. Results would take weeks. Patricia Daniels learned about the blood evidence from a news reporter who approached her outside the grocery store. She collapsed in the parking lot, her paper bag splitting open, cans rolling across the asphalt. Neighbors rushed to help her. Someone called an ambulance. She was treated for shock and released the same day. That evening, Patricia confronted her husband in their living room. The exact words of their argument remain known only to them, but neighbors on both sides of the house would later report hearing raised voices, Patricia screaming accusations, Thomas's voice lower and more controlled but equally intense. At some point during that argument, something crashed against a wall. At some point, Patricia said words that could not be unsaid. The investigation began to slow as March turned to April. The FBI had been consulted. Leads had been followed and exhausted. The blood evidence came back from the lab. It was human blood, type A positive, consistent with Rebecca's blood type, but also consistent with approximately 34% of the population. Without a body or additional evidence, prosecutors concluded they did not have sufficient grounds for an arrest. The case remained open, but active investigation diminished to occasional follow-ups and hope for new information. Thomas and Patricia Daniels existed in their house on Maple Drive, like two strangers occupying the same space. They spoke in logistical necessity, bills that needed paying, appointments that must be kept. Patricia threw herself into searching, maintaining contact with missing children organizations, updating Rebecca's information on databases, organizing annual awareness events. Thomas returned to work, resumed his daily routines, attended church on Sundays where congregation members offered sympathy that felt increasingly hollow with each passing week. Clears throat, 18 months after Rebecca vanished. In August of 1991, Patricia filed for separation. She moved into a small apartment on the east side of town, taking with her only the essentials: clothes, kitchen items, and every photograph of Rebecca she could find. She left behind the house on Maple Drive, unable to sleep in rooms where her daughter had played and laughed, and then simply ceased to exist. The separation surprised no one who knew them. Friends had watched the marriage deteriorate, had witnessed Patricia's increasing coldness toward Thomas, the way she flinched when he entered a room, the accusations that lived in her eyes, even when her mouth remained closed. At the food bank where she volunteered, Patricia confided to another volunteer that she could no longer look at her husband without seeing lies in his face, without wondering what he had done, what he knew. Thomas remained in the house alone. Those who saw him during this period described a man who seemed to be shrinking into himself, his shoulders increasingly hunched, his face drawn. He lost weight. His supervisor at the dealership noted that his performance was slipping, that he was making mistakes in inventory orders, forgetting to follow up with customers. But he showed up every day, clocked in precisely at 8, clocked out precisely at 5:30. The years accumulated like dust. 1992 became 1993 became 1994. Rebecca's case file grew thicker with dead-end leads and periodic reviews by different investigators. Detective Chen moved to a position with the FBI. Sergeant Doyle retired. New officers joined the Cookeville Police Department who had not been there the morning Rebecca disappeared, who knew the case only through reports and the fading memories of senior officers. Patricia eventually divorced Thomas in 1996. The proceeding was brief and largely uncontested. There were no custody disputes because there was no child, no property to divide beyond the house, which Thomas kept, and the savings account which they split. At the courthouse, they sat on opposite sides of the hallway waiting for their hearing, never speaking, never making eye contact. In 1998, Patricia remarried a man named David Woolsey who managed the local bank branch. They moved to Knoxville, putting distance between Patricia and the town where her daughter had vanished, the streets they had searched, the house where she had last tucked Rebecca into bed. She changed her name. She tried to build a new life. But those who have ever loved and lost a child know that there is no moving on, only moving forward while carrying a weight that never lessens. Thomas remained in Cookeville, still living in the house on Maple Drive, still working at the dealership. He became a fixture of routine and isolation, a man who existed at the edges of a community that had never fully absolved him in their collective mind. There were no charges, no arrest, no public declaration of guilt, but suspicion had settled around him like morning fog that never quite burned away. Rebecca's bedroom remained unchanged. Thomas kept the door closed, but on the rare occasions when neighbors or repair workers glimpsed inside, they reported that everything was precisely as it had been that February morning. The bed made with precision, the curtains drawn, the stuffed rabbit sitting on the pillow. The 10th anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance passed in 2000 with a small memorial service at Jefferson Elementary. Patricia attended, along with perhaps 20 people who still remembered, who still cared. Thomas did not attend. The local newspaper ran a brief article with an old photograph of Rebecca and a plea for any new information. The 15th anniversary came and went with even less notice. The 20th anniversary was marked only by a notation in the police department's cold case file, a reminder to review the evidence for any new forensic opportunities that advancing technology might provide. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have lived with suspicion eating away at the foundation of trust, you understand the particular torment of not knowing. Patricia Daniels lived with nightmares that played in continuous loops. Rebecca calling for her, Rebecca afraid, Rebecca hurt. She saw her daughter's face in every blonde child at the grocery store, heard her voice in every playground laugh. She created a mental prison of what-ifs and if-onlys, and no one could give her the key to escape. In the fall of 2022, 32 years after Rebecca Daniels disappeared, a woman named Jennifer Thompson was cleaning out her deceased mother's attic in Cookeville. Among the boxes of old clothes and forgotten furniture, she found a cardboard box labeled with her mother's maiden name. Inside were journals, dozens of them, spanning several decades. Jennifer's mother, Martha Louise Henderson, had been a meticulous keeper of diaries, recording daily observations with the dedication of a historian documenting ordinary life. Jennifer sat in the dusty attic reading through journals from the early 1990s, smiling at her mother's descriptions of church socials and garden club meetings, when she came across an entry dated February 14, 1990. Her mother had lived on Maple Drive, 3 houses down from the Daniels family. She had been part of the search effort for Rebecca. The entry was longer than most, filling several pages. Martha Louise had written about the terrible news, about little Rebecca missing, about the search parties forming. But then, several paragraphs in, she had written something that made Jennifer stop breathing. I was up early that morning before 5, couldn't sleep because of my back pain. I was looking out the kitchen window, watching the sky lighten, when I saw Thomas Daniels come out of his garage carrying something wrapped in a tarp. He put it in the trunk of his car and drove away. I didn't think much of it at the time, figured he was taking trash to the dump or heading to work early. But when I heard about Rebecca missing just a couple hours later, I remembered seeing him. I almost said something to the police, but then I thought, what did I really see? A man taking something to his car in the morning. That's not evidence of anything. And Thomas is such a nice man, always helpful, always friendly. I decided I was being silly, letting my imagination run away with me. But I've thought about it every day since. What was wrapped in that tarp? Where did he go so early? And why have I been too afraid to ask? Jennifer Thompson brought the journal to the Cookeville Police Department on October 12, 2022. The case had been cold for so long that the detective who received her had to search the archives to locate the file. But once he read Martha Louise Henderson's entry, he knew what it meant. The case was reopened with new urgency. Detective James Rodriguez, who had been with the department for 8 years and knew the Rebecca Daniels case only through legend, took point on the investigation. He began by reviewing every piece of evidence, every interview, every lead from 1990. He studied the timeline, the inconsistencies that had troubled Detective Chen 3 decades earlier. Then he did what had not been possible in 1990. He requested a complete forensic analysis of Thomas Daniels' 1987 Chevrolet Caprice, the car he had owned at the time of Rebecca's disappearance. The vehicle was still registered to Thomas, still parked in the garage on Maple Drive, now rusted and barely functional but intact. On November 3, 2022, forensic specialists transported the Caprice to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Laboratory. Using technology that had not existed in 1990, they treated the trunk with advanced chemical reagents that could detect blood residue even after decades. The trunk lit up like a constellation. Blood evidence, copious amounts, the pattern suggesting a body had been transported there. DNA analysis had advanced exponentially since 1990. The blood samples were processed through databases that contained millions of profiles. The DNA was a familial match to Patricia Daniels. The blood in the trunk had come from her biological child. On November 18, 2022, 32 years, 9 months, and 4 days after Rebecca Daniels disappeared, Detective Rodriguez and 6 other officers arrived at the house on Maple Drive with an arrest warrant. Thomas Daniels was 64 years old now, his hair white, his face carved with deep lines. He answered the door in his bathrobe, his expression confused until he saw the officers and the warrant, and then something shifted in his face, a sort of resignation, as though he had been waiting for this moment for 3 decades. "Thomas Daniels, you are under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Ann Daniels," Detective Rodriguez said, reading from the warrant. Thomas did not resist. He did not protest his innocence. He simply nodded, extended his wrists for the handcuffs, and allowed himself to be led to the waiting patrol car. Neighbors emerged onto their porches, watching the scene unfold on this quiet November morning, witnessing the conclusion of a mystery that had haunted their street since that cold February day in 1990. The news spread through Cookeville within hours, then across Tennessee by evening. Local stations interrupted regular programming to report the arrest. Patricia Daniels, now Patricia Woolsey, living in Knoxville, received the call from Detective Rodriguez. She sat down on her kitchen floor and wept, not tears of relief, but tears of a grief that had been held in suspension for 32 years, and could now finally complete its terrible work. In the days following the arrest, more evidence emerged. Investigators obtained warrants to search the Maple Drive house again. In the attic, sealed in plastic containers and hidden beneath insulation, they found Rebecca's pajamas, the pink ones with unicorns, stained with blood. They found a child's shoes, size 12, also stained. And they found a handwritten note, dated February 14, 1990, written in Thomas's handwriting. "God forgive me. I didn't mean for this to happen." She wouldn't stop crying. She wanted her mother. I just wanted her to be quiet. The confession, such as it was, remained incomplete. During interrogation, Thomas alternated between silence and partial admissions. He acknowledged that Rebecca had died in their home that night. He claimed it was an accident, that he had lost his temper when she woke up crying for Patricia, that he had struck her harder than he intended, that she had fallen and hit her head. He admitted to wrapping her body in a tarp and driving to a remote area of Cumberland County, where he had buried her in woods he had scouted weeks earlier. On December 3, 2022, acting on information Thomas provided during hours of interrogation, search teams located an area in Cherokee National Forest, approximately 40 miles from Cookeville, where ground-penetrating radar indicated a possible burial site. Excavation revealed skeletal remains at a depth of 4 feet, wrapped in a deteriorated tarp, the bones small and delicate and unmistakably those of a child. DNA confirmation came on December 17. The remains were Rebecca Ann Daniels. The trial began on August 14, 2023. Thomas Daniels pled guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for prosecutors dropping charges of first-degree murder that carried a potential death sentence. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Patricia Woolsey attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the front row, watching the man she had once loved and trusted describe the night he killed their daughter. In his allocution before sentencing, Thomas spoke for the first time publicly about what had happened. His voice was thin, trembling, barely audible in the silent courtroom. "I didn't plan it," he said. "I never meant to hurt her, but that night I'd been drinking and Patricia was working and Rebecca woke up crying. She wouldn't stop. She wanted her mama. I told her to be quiet to go back to sleep, but she kept crying and I lost control. I grabbed her, I shook her, I hit her. When I realized what I'd done, when I saw her lying there not moving, I panicked. I thought if I could hide what happened, I could figure out what to do later. But there was no later. There was only carrying that secret every day for 32 years, waiting for someone to find out, almost hoping they would because I couldn't keep carrying it alone." Patricia Woolsey did not speak in court, but later, outside on the courthouse steps, with cameras recording and reporters pressing forward. She read from a prepared statement, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. For 32 years, I lived with not knowing. I lived with suspecting but having no proof. I lived with guilt for leaving my daughter with someone I should have known better than to trust. Rebecca deserved better. She deserved to grow up, to go to prom, to graduate college, to have children of her own. She deserved justice. Today, she has part of that justice, but she will never have her life back, and I will never have my daughter back. Rebecca Ann Daniels was laid to rest on September 2, 2023, in Cookeville Memorial Park, beneath a maple tree that would turn brilliant red each autumn. Her headstone bore her dates, March 15, 1982 to February 14, 1990. Beneath that, a single line, Forever 7, forever loved, forever remembered. The case of Rebecca Daniels closed with an answer but not resolution. Those who have followed such stories know that solving a case does not heal the wounds it created, does not restore what was lost, does not undo the decades of pain and uncertainty. It merely provides a period where there had been only an ellipsis, a statement of fact where there had been only endless questions. Thomas Daniels sits in a Tennessee prison, an old man serving a sentence that will end only with his death. Patricia Woolsey continues her life in Knoxville, carrying her daughter's memory like a photograph pressed between the pages of a book, always there, always painful to look at, impossible to discard. The house on Maple Drive has new owners who painted over the yellow siding and removed the chain-link fence, erasing the physical markers of a tragedy that occurred within its walls. But in Cookeville, where church bells still mark the hours and neighbors still know each other's names, people remember. They remember a little girl with strawberry blonde hair who disappeared from a locked house on a cold February night. They remember the search efforts, the hope that dwindled, the questions that accumulated. They remember that sometimes the danger we fear from strangers in the dark is already inside our homes, wearing a familiar face, trusted with protecting the very people it destroys. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.